Today we're going to look and see how to mount a Triton router into your router table and router plate, specifically how to mark and drill that hole that's needed for the height crank. Stick around, we'll get into this topic. So if you're on the bandwagon of these routers now that don't need a router lift, they're pretty handy. One thing you'll notice is if you go to Rockler to get, say, a router plate for these Tritons will require a C-type Pro Plate from Rockler. They work pretty good. I've been happy with that product so far, but some of them don't come pre-drilled for the hole that you need. This is an access hole for the height crank or the winder handle. And so we'll show you how to locate that and quickly drill it out. And there's actually two options of where that hole can be drilled, and I'll show you what that means in terms of your controls and your dust collection. The standard method is to drill the height crank adjustment hole here, and that positions the router at a bit of an angle. You'll have good access to lock in your height, which you do want to do every time because on this router there's about 1/8 of an inch play on your vertical movement until you lock that down. Now once locked down, everything is good and solid. The other thing you need to access is the power switch, and of course with this you can't leave that locked on all the time. There's a safety feature that won't allow you to raise the bit high enough up to lock the collet and change bits without first taking this safety switch off. So you have to power it down manually from underneath each time you change bits, and there's no way to bypass that. So for that reason, you want to have good access to not just the locking lever but also the power switch, however you decide to mount this router. In that standard orientation, your dust collection port will exit off the right side as you face the router table. You'll notice there's a couple bolts that keep the plate from laying flat on the router, so remember to remove those before you proceed. There's two sizes of screws that come with the Rockler C plate. For this 2¼ horsepower Triton router, we'll use the smaller of the two. And then use the winding handle itself to mark the spot for the access hole. And using a 29/64 bit, go ahead and create a dimple on the bottom of the router plate, and then switch over to a 1/4 inch bit and you can punch all the way through. From there, just flip your plate over and use progressively larger bits until you get up to the final size of 29/64. That, as it turns out, is the perfect size for your winding crank handle. After that, you can just chamfer the top of the hole a little bit to make it easier on the hands. And the last step is to remove the plunge spring from the router. Once you pull the spring out, you can replace the cap and screw that came with your tool. If you've accurately located your hole, it'll offer a little bit of support to the shaft of the crank handle as you insert it, and that'll just guide you down to the mechanism on the router. And then let's look at one big drawback to the standard orientation as you mount the plate onto your router, and that has to do with fence adjustments. With this more standard layout, it's a little bit easier to drop the router and plate down into position, and that looks pretty good. With this layout, of course, this will be your access hole for bit height adjustment. And the drawback there is, as you bring your fence into position, you can either do one of two things. You can set your fence position or you can adjust bit height. You can't do both simultaneously. And that's a big drawback for me. I usually would set the fence even to the bearing and then make adjustments throughout the project so I can make multiple passes for really clean cuts. And this actually prevents me from doing that. So that's the big drawback with the standard orientation. So here's the other option where the access hole is drilled in the front, and that's a big benefit because you can still make height adjustments and that won't interfere with your fence. So if you need to make slight adjustments throughout the project, there's nothing to interfere with that. I also think that this is a nice access to have this handle available for coarse adjustment. You still have good access to the locking knob, but it's a little bit of a reach back to the power switch. So just things to consider as you're deciding whether you want to do this more angled approach with the hole in the front or more of a standard approach with the hole in the side. I would just need to relieve a little bit of this MDF material because the hose needs to mount fairly high if you attach your dust collection from the back. And the other issue I ran into was magnetic catches at the front of the router table. The mounting block for these catches just prevents the router from raising up all the way, but that'd be easy to modify if I choose to. The only awkward thing about mounting the router like this at a more extreme sideways angle is you have to kind of rotate the router as you drop it down in. And that's just to help the handles clear the router table. Just a funny little tip and rotate to get that into position. But this approach does point the dust collection port straight towards the back of the router table, and that may be a real advantage for some people. Dust collection is fair, but not great. Granted, that was a full depth pass with a 2.5 inch panel raising bit, which is more than you'd likely do in a normal shop situation. And the factory dust fitting on the Triton does let a few shavings through to the bottom of the cabinet as well. This is after just 2 passes. Of the 2 mounting options, I chose the one where the height adjustment crank would be in line with the router table fence. That gives me the best access to the locking lever and the power switch. Of course, remember you have to turn the power switch off anytime you raise the router up all the way to change bits. It's an inconvenience, but that's just the way this machine is built. Boy, I have got a ton of router content coming up, so remember to subscribe to the Thoughtful Woodworker channel. And if you've already found that video you like, please give it a thumbs up. Hey, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.